Welcome to Creative Tien channel. Today we want to look at the seed stitches and the moss stitch and the variation of those stitches. If you do hand knitting, you must heard of the seed stitch. It's basically alternating a knit and purl stitch, and every other row it will be offset, so it creates a raised texture. And one major advantage of using the seed stitch is that it's reversible. Fabric will not curl, it will stay flat. And there are several similar stitches I like to talk about, and we will try to do it on a knitting machine. Another popular stitch that's very similar to the seed stitch is called a double moss stitch. And you can see the pattern here. You repeat the first and second row and offset the next two rows. So you will create a bigger pattern, a slightly bigger texture. And another variation is called the Irish moss stitch. It's very similar to the double moss, but instead of having knit, knit, purl, purl, it has knit, purl, but also repeat two rows at a time. So first and the second rows are the same, and the third and fourth are the same. People call these stitches in different names, but generally the seed stitch is one knit, one purl, and offset in the second row. And sometimes those names are interchangeable, but it really doesn't matter. You can decide which pattern matches your project the best, or which result you like the best. That's why today I want to do a little bit sample to look at the different variations. And since we are doing the machine knitting, we have to hand manipulate the purl stitch. So we try to keep it simple. So there's another type of variation that we can insert a plain row in between the pattern rows. For example, the seed stitch, you have the first row, and then you have a plain stitch, and then you have the second row, you have the plain stitch, and then repeat the first row, plain stitch, second row, plain stitch. So the pattern is spreading out a little bit. Overall, you still read it as a seed stitch. But the advantage of inserting the plain row is that it takes less manipulation, less effort when you do it on a knitting machine. And here is the double moss stitch with a plain row in between, so you can see the pattern spread out a little bit. And here is the Irish moss and plain rows in between. Based on the same logic, there's another variation. I don't have a name for this, I just call it a variation. So this one has horizontal continuous stitches. So that's very similar to Irish moss, except it's more horizontal texture. And when we insert the plain row, it will look like that. It spreads out a little bit. So that's another choice. And there are many other variations you can try. Maybe you can insert two plain rows instead of one in between the patterns. So today I'm going to use my LK 150 knitting machine. I will start with a seed stitch. I call it 1.1. And I will do the seed stitch with plain rows. I call it 1.2. And then I will go to the double moss stitches. I call it 2.1. And then double moss with plain rows, 2.2. And then Irish moss stitch, 3.1. Irish moss with the plain rows in between, 3.2. And the last one is a variation, 4.1, and the variation with plain rows, 4.2. So we have basically 4 different types plus the plain rows for those 4 different types. So we should have totally 8 different samples. I will cast on 21 rows because all the patterns are even numbers And if I add one more row, it will be more symmetrical. I just start with my simple E-rub. And I'm going to need a few rows. And the weight. I'm going to start with my first pattern, the basic seed stitch. So it's alternating between knit and purl. And I'm not going to manipulate the edge stitch on the left and the right because that one is a little bit difficult to manipulate. So I will start from the second stitch. I will use the X symbol as the purl stitch. So I will start with the third stitch and manipulate it into purl. Just use the ledge tool and insert into the stitch below. That's the third stitch, and below that insert it and drop the stitch, push down a little bit. We move the first loop beyond the ledge and then close it by pushing down the needle. Now we just reformed one stitch. And skip one, the next one, insert the needle, drop the stitch, and move the loop beyond the hook. Grab the yarn, pull down, and hand it back. Next one. It takes some practice. At first, it's always a little bit tricky. It's easier to insert the hook first so you don't lose the stitch. So the purl stitch manipulation is the same for all of those patterns. That's the only manipulation you need to know. Now we finish the first row, and we'll knit one row and continue our second row. So the second row starts with the second stitch. So here's the second stitch, insert the hook. The fourth stitch. Now we finish the second row, we will knit one row and repeat the first row. So that's a 2-row repeat. Now we'll repeat row 1 again and then repeat row 2. And then continue going, we'll see the pattern. And one good thing about this type of stitch is that you can replace the ribbing because you will not curl. It might be less stretchy than the ribbing, but depends on the design. You can still use it as the edge of the garment or in the area you don't need it to be very stretchy. But looks like the Irish moss, this looks very similar to the ribbing. So we just have to try and see. It's easier if you push out the stitches you need to work on first, so you don't miss the stitches. I just finished the first part, the seed stitch sample. It looks the same on both sides. I need a few plain rows, and I'm going to need 1.2. That's a seed stitch with plain rows. So I'll keep going, I'll finish this, and we'll look at the results. For the double moss stitch and even the Irish moss, since we have the same stitch continuously for 2 rows, so we can knit the 2 rows first and then manipulate those stitches at the same time. So now I just finished my first and second row, I will knit 2 rows and then manipulate those 2 rows together. So it's the third and fourth. I pick out the stitches first. So instead of going 1 stitch down, I go 2 stitch down and then drop the needle and latch back up. It's kind of like the ribbon when you reform. 1, 2. Now we finally finish all the patterns. We'll compare with the chart and take a closer look. The first one is a basic seed stitch. It's the same on both sides. The second one is a seed stitch with plain rows. So it kind of stretch out the pattern a little bit. That's a seed, that's with plain rows. And here's the back side. With a plain row in between, the back side look different. So it's not identical in the front and back anymore. And then we have the double moss stitch. Here's our double moss stitch. Compared to the seed stitch, the texture is different. And the back side is the same as the front. And then we have the double moss with plain rows in between. That's this one. You can compare. This one is without plain rows. This one is with plain rows. It's still flat. It doesn't really curl, but the front and back will be different. I actually like the back side better. That's a double moss. That's a double moss with plain rows. It's less textured. The next one is the Irish moss. That's a vertical repeat. That's this one. Let's look at the back side. It's the same. Irish moss. And here is the Irish moss with a plain row in between the patterns. So you see it's very similar, but it has more pronounced straight vertical lines. The back side looks different, but I like the texture. It almost looks like a honeycomb. It's kind of more three-dimensional. The basic Irish moss and Irish moss with plain rows in between. The last pattern is a variation similar to Irish moss, but I have the repeat horizontally. So 2 purl, 2 knit, 2 purl, 2 knit. And this is the pattern that takes longest time because you have so many horizontal repeat. You have to do hand manipulation, and it's just slow to hand manipulate. Here's the back side, looks the same. And then the last one is a variation with the plain rows. You can see it's less textured, but it goes faster than the variation. Here's the back side. The last variation one also create the widest fabric. It stretch out horizontally. So it depends on your design. You can pick any pattern you like. My favorite one is actually this one. That kind of surprised me because when you look closely, it looks like just a basket weave. It has squares of knit and squares of purl. That's a double Irish moss here, but this one with a plain row in between, it makes bigger pattern. And look at the back side, it has interesting texture. It's not identical front and back, but still very interesting. That's an Irish moss with a vertical repeat, so it creates a small vertical line. And I like that with the horizontal plain rows too. And that's the back side. I like the one with the plain rows better. So that's my seed stitch, moss stitch, and the variations done on the knitting machine LK150. Because it's hand manipulation, it really doesn't matter which model of the machine you use. So thank you so much for watching today, and see you next time.